Midway Atoll, June 4, 1942. In a matter of hours, a plan that had seemed flawless unraveled into something none of the commanders expected. 4 carriers that had been the backbone of a sweeping offensive were sinking or burning, and the officers on the flagship felt the earth shift under their boots as if a trapdoor had opened. It was impossible. A fleet conceived to decide the Pacific was suddenly exposed, and the words that would travel back to Tokyo changed everything. When Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto heard the initial confirmation, witnesses later wrote that his face went ashen and his hands would not stop trembling. But there was more than military loss. There was a message, read in a small room, that would be buried for decades, and that so changed the tone of command that it redirected strategy and silenced dissent. What they chose to say aloud, and what they tried to cover up, would reshape the next year of the war. On the carrier decks, the scene was immediate and sensory. Smoke tasted of metal and cordite in the mouths of young pilots. The sky was a bright, washed blue that made the black plumes look obscene. Men shouted over the whine of engines and the distant staccato of anti-aircraft fire. Salt stung sweat that had dried on faces and mixed with the smell of fuel. The ship trembled under footfalls, and the deck shuddered as planes crashed or slid into the sea. In one tight sequence, Vice Admiral Chūichi Nagumo barked orders, then hesitated, then barked again. "Turn the deck," he shouted. "Ready green deck 3, answered Captain Masao Tateyama. "We have lost the element of surprise," Nagumo said, voice raw. "We must regroup," replied Rear Admiral Matome Ugaki. "There is no time," Tateyama said, his hands slick as he pointed to the smoke. "We cannot recover all aircraft," Nagumo said. "Send confirmation back to headquarters now," another aide, Lieutenant Commander Kazuhiro Nakamura, insisted. "I will send it," an operator, Hiroshi Sato, said, fingers moving over the radio with a smell of oil under his nails. Each line of dialogue lengthened the pause between hope and acceptance, until the pause itself became a sound, heavy and final. At sea, the theater of operations turned into a study of immediate paralysis. Flame reflected in windows of the command tent like a second horizon. Signals officers stared at flags that no longer matched the map of intent. A survivor later described the silence that followed a successful strike, a silence that felt like a held breath before a storm. "We had always believed in a decisive blow," he wrote in a diary that would surface years later. That evening, the promise of victory became a memory of smoke. The officers in charge alternated between action and disbelief. Communications were choked with fragments, with lost and repeat and request permission, until the words themselves lost meaning. Admiral Nobutake Kondo paced, the soles of his boots whispering on the deck, the taste of seawater on his tongue. "Where are the carriers?" he asked. "They are sinking," said a runner, voice thin. "We have no confirmation of the flagship," someone answered, and the room folded into a stunned, searching quiet. The message came to Tokyo in a small sealed telegram, delivered through channels that usually moved with ritual speed. In the inner room of the Imperial General Headquarters, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo and other ministers waited as a courier read the contents. "Enemy air-to-sea assault inflicted severe damage," the courier read. "Carriers lost. Situation grave." Yamamoto listened, eyes on the map table, the paper trembling slightly in his hands. He was a figure who had always balanced daring and meticulous planning. "How many?" Tojo asked, voice flat. "Several carriers confirmed lost," replied the communications officer, Sergeant Hiromi Tanaka. "We must control the message," Tojo said after a long beat. "We need to maintain public morale," added Colonel Satoshi Fujimura, lowering his voice. "If the public believes defeat, industry will falter." Yamamoto said nothing for a moment, then leaned forward.
"We must state damage but not panic," he said, as if measuring each word on a scale. "We will frame this as a tactical setback." The room smelled of old cigar smoke and ink. The decision to shape what was reported was made as much to preserve the front at home as to buy time for reorganizing fleets. The first public statements were terse and calculated. "Damage has been sustained," announced a radio brief read by a calm voice. Inside command, debate raged. "If we admit the loss of carriers, we may lose the initiative," argued Rear Admiral Kazuhiro Nakamura. "But hiding the truth will cost us strategic clarity," countered Captain Masato Tateyama. "We need shipbuilding redirected," urged Admiral Kondo. "The factories are not prepared to shift without orders," said Minister of Munitions Satoru Endo. A confidential aide, Hiroshi Sato, later wrote in a diary that he had seen the stack of censored reports, each stamped classified and set aside. The choices made in that room translated into delays and misallocations. Orders that might have evacuated convoys or reinforced defensive islands were postponed because the public narrative was designed to show resilience, not vulnerability. It was not as if no one had warned them. Months earlier, an intelligence summary had highlighted the risk of overextending carrier groups and the possibility that reconnaissance gaps would allow enemy dive bombers to exploit deck operations. That report bore the signatures of intelligence officer Keiji Matsuda and naval analyst Eiko Watanabe, and suggested dispersal and improved radar coordination. Yamamoto had read the memo. In a private meeting with Nagumo, recorded in a diary entry found among Nagumo's papers, he had said, "We cannot gamble everything on perfect timing." The warning lingered like a faint alarm that went unheeded. The backstory here is a pattern of warnings framed as hypothetical, then shelved as optimism. The smell of cigarette smoke in the briefing room, the taste of bitter tea on the tongue of an exhausted official, and the rustle of papers all became elements of a memory in which opportunity for mitigation slipped away. Newsrooms in Tokyo and regional newspapers echoed the official tone. Journalists like Kenji Mori and Akiko Hayashi filed reports that emphasized heroism and downplayed strategic loss. In the chambers of the emperor's advisors, conversations turned from tactical details to damage control. "We will report bravery," said an aide, Yoshio Nakamura. "We will not discuss failures," said another. The press adopted euphemisms, and the name of carriers that had been sunk was omitted from lists of operational ships. Families of sailors received delayed or partial notices. Survivors who made it back told stories of flames tasting like iron, of men with hands burned to the bone, of the shock of being told to smile for cameras as they disembarked. The cultural machinery closed ranks, and the official narrative hardened. The immediate tactical consequences were stark and measurable. Convoy schedules remained unchanged in some theaters because logistics planners had not been warned of the true scale of losses. Admiral Nobutake Kondo later testified in private to a panel that without accurate reporting, he had been unable to redeploy escorts in time to prevent subsequent sinkings. Observers from neutral ports wrote about intercepted messages that hinted at confusion. "They were telling themselves a story so they could move on," one foreign attaché noted. Names of officers like Matome Ugaki and Keiji Matsuda reappear in reports analyzing decisions made under this fog. The strategic collapse was not instantaneous but cumulative, a series of errors sown by a choice to prioritize image over readiness. If you were in that small room when the telegram arrived, how would you react? Imagine hearing news that rewrites the next year of lives and having to choose between telling a terrifying truth or soothing a frightened country. Leave a comment below, starting with "A worst consequence is," and tell us which outcome you fear most: loss of lives, strategic paralysis, or a breakdown of trust. The comments will shape our next video, where we examine 3 responses and compare them to actual decisions made in this crisis. Now continue with the story as we trace the fallout month by month. 1 month later, Admiral Nobutake Kondo was reallocating what remained of carrier groups and ordered a limited strike group under Captain Masao Tateyama to escort supply lines. Factories in Osaka began to retool, but at a slower pace than needed because ministers had delayed emergency orders. Keiji Matsuda, the intelligence officer, was reassigned to a desk job and wrote bitter entries about being silenced. Survivors like Lieutenant Commander Kazuhiro Nakamura lobbied for better maintenance and more realistic training cycles. 3 months later, the domestic narrative had solidified into proud resilience. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo gave a speech praising sacrifice. And yet, in quiet rooms, Yamamoto and Nagumo argued over whether to risk remaining carriers on an offensive. Industry reports by Satoru Aoiki
Endo documented shortages that would have been addressed sooner with frank communication. 6 months on, the strategic map had shifted. Islands once assumed secure now required urgent reinforcement, and convoys had suffered increased losses. Names like Matome Ugaki appeared in internal reports as officers who had pressed for honesty and were sidelined. Diaries surfaced in the following years. An aide, Hiroshi Sato, had copied pages and hidden them. "We lost more than ships," he wrote. "We lost the chance to change course." In the end, the recorded decision to frame the disaster as a tactical setback rather than a systemic collapse remained a choice between two risks. The choice bought temporary calm and preserved the myth of initiative, but it narrowed options and cost lives later. There were documents, telegrams, and diaries that confirmed the sequence of events and the deliberate language choices at headquarters. The truth took decades to emerge fully. If you found this account revealing, subscribe to the channel to see the documents we used and to follow the next episode where we open archives and read the original telegrams and diary entries. The cost of silence was measured not only in lost ships, but in lost opportunity to adapt. The moral is stark and simple. Admitting harsh realities may save more lives than protecting reputations. The war might have been turned in a day, but it was buried by years of silence.